Okay, Dr. Kim Delaney. And she has a PowerPoint presentation that she's going to be walking through. So if you need to adjust your chairs, please feel free to do so.
Kim Delaney from Council staff. What we have for you this morning is an update with respect to the All-Over Florida project. Pardon me. And let's see. Yep. There we go. So just a recap for Council. There are a number of different passenger rail projects that are on the horizon, if you will, in Southeast Florida. There's Amtrak service, which runs today on the CSX rail corridor, which is out west, running north to Indiantown and then breaking west towards Lakeland and into Orlando, Tampa, and points north. Amtrak service has also been proposed on the FEC corridor from Miami to West Palm Beach, where that service would interconnect and join the FEC corridor heading north from West Palm to Jacksonville. Tri-rail service today runs on the CSX corridor, 72 miles between Mangonia Park, which is central Palm Beach County, and Miami International Airport. Tri-rail service is also proposed with a new name, if you will, Tri-rail Coastal Link service, which would include an extension of Tri-rail on the FEC corridor from Jupiter down to Miami, with interconnections with existing Tri-rail service that would continue to run from Mangonia Park to Miami International Airport. And then the most recent proposal is the All-Over Florida proposal, which is proposed to run on the FEC corridor from Miami to West Palm Beach. From Miami to Orlando, with additional stations in Fort Lauderdale and West Palm Beach. That in the past, the service has been proposed to be extended ultimately to Tampa and Jacksonville, as well as other points. But the current proposal just focuses on the Miami to Orlando segment of that project. A bit of background on the All-Over Florida project. It is a private proposal by Florida East Coast Industries, which is a division within Fortress Investment Group, which owns the FEC corridor. It is a privately funded proposal, which is unique. There's no precedent for it in the nation. The proposal is to run service on the FEC rail corridor from Miami to Cocoa, and then along State Road 528, which is a state roadway, from Cocoa to Orlando. There are 4 stations that are proposed in this initial segment, which are Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm, and Orlando. The service frequency would be 16 trains each hour, each direction, so there are 32 trains, with the service schedule running from roughly 6 a.m. to 9 p.m., according to the company's representatives. The time frame for the project, the latest estimates continue to be expected construction beginning sometime in 2014. With service beginning as early as perhaps 2016. With respect to permits, the company is currently in the process of developing or has developed an environmental impact statement. That is through the Federal Railroad Administration, which is the regulatory agency with response to passenger rail. And I have some detail about that process that follows. With respect to history, Council was first introduced to the project in March 2012. That's when the company made its public announcement. Sometime back in 2012, according to the Federal Railroad Administration, the company submitted or began the process to secure what's called a Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing Loan, or a RIP loan as it's referred. That set in motion the need for the FRA to develop an environmental impact statement. That is a permit document that must be developed in compliance with NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and that requires compliance with a whole host of different federal regulations with respect to environmental planning conditions, if you will. So that EIS document, if I can use those acronyms because it'll be very long otherwise. So the EIS, Environmental Impact Statement, was submitted back in October of 2012, and the company received approval for improvements on the southern segment, that's just from West Palm to Miami, in January of 2013. Moving forward, the EIS document for the ultimate phase, if you will, the complete project from Miami to Orlando, including track improvements from West Palm to Orlando, as well as grade crossing improvements, the station locations, and the bridges. All of those details are subject to the EIS process that's underway now. The expectation is that FRA will conduct scoping meetings. Best estimate from the agency is perhaps as early as May. We're continuing to communicate with FRA to get an updated schedule. Those scoping meetings are expected to take place along the corridor. And what's been suggested is Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm, somewhere in the Treasure Coast, likely Stewart or Fort Pierce, up in Brevard County, somewhere, and Orlando as well. The agency will establish those workshops, and of course, when we receive notice of the notice of those workshops will be communicated to council. With respect to the EIS process in particular, as we understand the process for this project, this slide kind of details that timeline, if you will. And so the FRA expects to publish what's called a draft EIS later this spring. Again, the expectation is likely in May, according to our latest discussions with the FRA. And then a series of public workshops will be held to gain public comment towards the draft EIS. The public comment period is a 45-day comment period, which can be extended at the discretion of the FRA. After the public comments are received, the FRA will take that data back. They will review the documents that have been submitted, they'll review the public comments, and ultimately they will issue what's called a final EIS, or a final environmental impact statement. That triggers another public comment period, which is a minimum of 30 days, and that can be extended as well at the discretion of the FRA. And then after that public comment is received and processed, the FRA would indicate what's called a record of decision, or a ROD, as it's referred to in the industry. Just trying to use the acronyms. The council's involvement in the project has been extensive. Since the project was announced in May of 2012, the council has participated in 31 public hearings, 21 public workshops, 53 briefings with elected officials and management staff of local governments to the region, as well as other briefings and workshops, for example, neighborhood association meetings and town hall meetings. Council's role in that effort has been to deliver information to all interested parties and then receive information from all interested parties in advance of the EIS so that we can be as thorough as possible. At this point in time, as the staff report indicates, there are some early findings and potential impacts that have been identified in all that public outreach that's been taking place. That information is categorized in the categories that are noted on this slide. They relate to passenger rail stations, grade crossing improvements and quiet zones, bridge and marine navigation conflicts, access to broadband capacity, freight rationalization, land use impacts, and the Tri-Rail Coastal Link access negotiations. So the next series of slides just touches on each of those categories, which tracks the staff report. First, with respect to passenger rail stations, as council is familiar, the Amtrak FEC Corridor project has been a priority in the region for many years. One of the issues that's been raised is the desire for that service to be advanced immediately, perhaps in conjunction with the Elwood Florida project. There will be extensive coordination still required among local governments, FDOT, which is the Department of Transportation, Amtrak, and FECI, and stations already have been identified in Stewart, Fort Pierce, and Bureau. With respect to those stations, there's also been a desire expressed for all World Florida service to also service those stations in its initial phase of service. What's been suggested is perhaps limited service. It's a point of continuing discussion with FECI and those communities. It would require, of course, collaboration among local governments, FDOT, which would be funding those stations through the Amtrak funds that are already allocated, and FECI. The additional issue which has been raised with respect to stations is particularly with regard to the Old Florida station in downtown West Palm Beach. The way the station is currently configured, All World Florida would require a 1,000-foot platform. That would require the closure of 2 grade crossings in downtown West Palm Beach. The station location is currently suggested just south of Fanatis, and so it would require the closure of Detroit and Bernie Streets. Council staff has continued to work with the city, All Over Florida, and FDOT to try to evaluate how passenger circulation, pedestrian circulation can be maintained in the vicinity of those grade crossings. So that's a continuing point of concern. It is not addressed directly in the staff report, but it is a continuing point that should be added really to complete the discussion with respect to passenger rail stations. The next category is with respect to grade crossing improvements and quiet zones. As council is aware, the Palm Beach MPO and the Broward MPO, those are metropolitan planning organizations, are in the process now of developing a TIGER grant application. TIGER is Transportation Investments Generating Economic Recovery, which is a federal grant program. That TIGER grant application is to construct safety infrastructure to allow quiet zones to be established from Palm Beach County through Broward County. Pardon me. FECI is participating along with FDOT in the development of that grant application. What has been raised in the public outreach conducted by council is a desire for additional FDOT funding to offset the costs for local governments, particularly north of Palm Beach County, and I would focus in Martin County north through St. Lucie Indian River and perhaps Brevard County as well. In addition, there's been interest raised with respect to a potential Tiger Grant application for those northern counties as well. Those funds are available for that type of infrastructure improvement. Palm Beach and Broward County have been working actively on the Quiet Zone application for more than a year, and council staff has been assisting them with that effort. However, given the timing of the project, the opportunity to add the northern counties into that Tiger Grant application is an issue that's been raised. It would require additional collaboration among the local governments, FDOT, and FECI. And again, that application would need to be partnered quickly because the grant application is due April 28th. It's a very competitive grant program, but that is an opportunity that exists that has been raised through the public outreach efforts. In addition, there has been very strong interest expressed in local communities about the need to establish pedestrian pathways at all grade crossings. The way grade crossings are currently designed, of course, the local governments or the public authorities are responsible for the costs of infrastructure in those grade crossings, and that's been a point of continuing discussion with council. The concern that has been raised is the need for, when those grade crossings are reconstructed, for all of them to be designed to accommodate safe pedestrian passage. There is an issue of trespassing that's been documented along the corridor, and the issue of trespassing prevention has been raised as well in the discussion of this project in the communities, and safe pedestrian pathways at legal grade crossings is a measure to help mitigate that. In addition, there have been concerns raised with respect to the grade crossing fee schedule. As I mentioned, each local government and public authority has an individual grade crossing agreement which governs the method by which operations and maintenance of grade crossing infrastructure are paid for. All of the grade crossings exist at the pleasure of the local governments, if you will, by request of the local governments, and FECI has protected itself in grade crossing agreements. The local governments pay for that infrastructure. There are not consistent terms within those grade crossing agreements. There are 352 grade crossings between Cocoa and Miami. Those terms vary. Some of the agreements date back to the 1920s. And so the request that's been raised in public outreach is for some consistency to be established with respect to how much the local governments pay and what the rate of increase is over time. The rate of increase for local governments varies, and so it ranges. In some years it's a 2% increase, in some years it's a 4%, and it makes it a great challenge for local governments to budget to maintain that obligation. In addition, with respect to the corridor from West Palm Beach north to Cocoa, the company has indicated the train speeds would be 110 miles an hour. The FRA, the Federal Railroad Administration, has referred to a sealed corridor, and that term is in quotes not by accident. There is no definition for what a sealed corridor is. There's been a lot of discussion among the local governments and agencies about what a sealed corridor means and what safety requirements will be required. And so, as a continuing point raised by through the outreach, is a request that the FRA specify what is a sealed corridor, what needs to be installed, and who's responsible for those improvements when a sealed corridor is established. The next category is with respect to bridge and marine navigation conflicts. Pardon me. The addition of 32 trains per day would mean that the bridges in the region, in particular the two in the Loxahatchee River Bridge and the St. Lucie River Bridge, which are the two movable bridges in the region, would need to close every time those trains come through. That's raised a significant amount of discussion among the public and local governments. With respect to issues carrying forward, one issue that's been requested is for passenger and freight schedules to be synchronized, so that when the bridges close once for a passenger train, a freight train crosses at the same time. It's council's understanding, based on workshops with the public and with FECI, the ideal schedule for bridge closings would have the bridge closed for not more than 12 minutes. That would be accomplished with infrastructure to be installed by FECI. Even if those bridges close twice an hour for 12 minutes, that's 24 minutes of closure just for passenger trains. And the bridges would need to remain down for additional time for freight trains to cross behind them. In addition, the issue that's been raised is the establishment of time limits on the maximum amount of time bridges can be closed. The Code of Federal Regulations regulates the two bridges in St. Lucie and Loxahatchee. The regulations indicate the bridges are to remain normally in the open position, and there's concern that's been raised that with the amount of increased traffic, the bridges would no longer be normally open. It could be closed for more than 30 minutes out of 60, for example. And so the issue that's been raised is the ability to amend the Code of Federal Regulations to redefine how the bridges are controlled, if you will, with respect to marine navigation, to ensure that marine navigation can be maintained. Pardon me. Additional issues that have been raised are the establishment of bridge tenders, human surveillance at the bridges. FECI has indicated a bridge tender will be installed at the New River Bridge to improve the safety of how the bridge is operated. What has been raised through outreach is the potential for bridge tenders to also be installed in Stewart and Jupiter to Cuesta. There is public land available in both of those locations for the accommodation of a bridge tender structure. And so that issue is raised going forward. The modernization of bridge structures and mechanisms has also been raised. Each of the bridges in Stewart and Jupiter to Cuesta date back to the 1920s. And so the bridges are fairly antiquated, and concerns have been raised about the consistency of opening and closing, and the occasions when the bridges have gotten stuck in the closed position, which causes an impedance to marine navigation. And so the request that's been raised is to fully modernize the bridge mechanically so that the bridge is open and closed more consistently and without delay. Unique to the Loxahatchee River Bridge is the Village of Tequesta's police fire vessel, which is an advanced life safety vessel. It is docked on the west side of the east side of the bridge, but it frequently, of course, makes calls on the west side of the bridge, where there's a lot of recreational boating activities, particularly with respect to the sandbars, as well as a number of residential and public and recreational land. When the bridge is closed, the fire safety vessel can't get to folks that are in distress on the west side. So the issue that's been raised is for the provision of an additional vessel and dock to be located on the west side of that bridge so that folks can be accessed in times of need. Finally, with respect to bridges and marine navigational issues, is the long-term reconstruction of those two bridges. There are a number of issues that have been raised with respect to the age of the bridges and current conditions. Specifically with respect to the Loxahatchee River Bridge, there's been requests for the bridge to be widened and raised. When it's in a closed position, there's only about 6 feet of clearance. So aside from kayaks and canoes, no vessels can get underneath that bridge when it's closed. So a long-term reconstruction could allow the bridge to be raised and widened. Similar issues have been raised for the St. Lucie River Bridge as well. And there's an additional complication, which is that bridge isn't aligned with the vehicular bridge that's located immediately to the west. The old US 1 bridge, which is now the A1A bridge, has an opening that's skewed. And so boats have to carefully navigate to get through that crossing. It's also a conflict for cargo traffic as well. And so the staff recommendation is a bridge should be established. Thank you very much. With multiple entities so that the long-term reconstruction of those bridges can be considered. It's important to note both the FEC and CSX corridors are on the state's Strategic Intermodal System, or SIS, that makes them eligible for FDOT dollars for those types of purposes. Next category, access to broadband capacity. As Council is aware, FECI has indicated it will install conduit throughout the corridor from Jacksonville to Miami and install fiber optic capacity to expand the broadband capabilities of the entire coast. There have been continued requests by Council that discounted access to that capacity should be established for certain public entities, local governments and agencies, the educational system, hospitals, and not-for-profit biomedical institutions. This is a significant economic development opportunity for the region, and the opportunity exists with this infrastructure improvement to advance that. Freight rationalization and the rationalization of rail traffic on both the CSX and FEC corridors has also been raised with respect to the discussion of the project. This is a long-term and very complex issue. There have been consistent concerns raised about freight traffic on the FEC corridor over time. and additional concerns raised as freight has begun to increase again as the economy has recovered. Those concerns are heightened with the opening of the Panama Canal and the introduction of post-Panamax freight ships, which will be coming in and servicing the ports of Miami and Fort Lauderdale, or Everglades and Fort Miami, which are both being deepened to accommodate those vessels. The post-Panamax ships, and one is illustrated on the bottom left, carry 3 times the amount of cargo capacity that current ships are able to carry. So that enormous inbound freight will continue to create conflicts through the region on the FEC corridor. There have been rail connections that are constructed or under the construction process to connect the CSX and FEC rail corridors, and the state is currently studying the rationalization of freight, which means how freight should be distributed when it comes into those southern ports, how much of it can move out to the west and move up the center of the state into central Florida, and how much of it must continue up the FEC coast and travel along that route. So the rationalization of these two types of rail activity is a subject that's been raised consistently through the outreach that we've conducted. Suggestions have been made to move as much cargo as possible out to the western tracks and keep the eastern tracks for passenger rail because they're the ones that run through the downtowns. Suggestions have also been raised to move the passenger trains out west because they're going to be fast-moving trains and keep the cargo running in the east. This is a complex issue. It needs a lot more discussion. It's certainly one that is appropriate to be raised in the discussion of this project, and it is so in your staff report. Land use and transportation impacts, and almost at the end, I think this is number 6. Land use and transportation impacts have been raised as well. There are a number of dimensions to this issue. One is that FECI has proposed a double traffic corridor, and that means in certain downtowns, locally Stewart as an example, but there are others as well, there are key economic improvements, parking in particular, that have been constructed in the FEC right-of-way with permission by FECI. The loss of those types of improvements have a significant impact economically in those downtowns. And so the issue that has been raised is for the projects to consider adjusting where those track improvements would take place to be able to protect those types of infrastructure improvements which have been funded by local governments in those downtowns. There's also a concern that's been raised with respect to the impact upon property values generally along the corridor, and there's no data that's analyzed that to date that we're aware of, so that's an ongoing subject of discussion. And finally, additional conflict has been raised with respect to traffic circulation and emergency response. The additional rail traffic proposed on the corridor will create some conflicts for traffic circulation by regular vehicles as well as emergency response. This is an issue that could be further explored by looking at the location of sightings to accommodate freight trains so they don't conflict with grade crossings. There's a communications protocol that's not understood at this point with respect to how that conversation would take place. There's a large freight train that's approaching and access to a hospital, for example. So this is raised as a point of continuing discussion. And finally, the Tri-Rail Coastal Link access negotiations have been raised with respect to the project. As Council is aware, there's a memorandum of understanding that was adopted last year to enable negotiations to proceed with FECI, FDOT, the Florida Department of Transportation, and the SFRTA, the South Florida Regional Transportation Authority. That would allow the Tri-Rail service to be extended onto the FEC corridor from Jupiter to Miami, which has been a long-standing priority for the 3 counties to the south as well as the local governments. Those negotiations have not proceeded as quickly as many had imagined they would, and so raised as a continuing point of discussion for the receipt of the FRA is the need for those negotiations to be finalized. The double tracking proposed by FECI would allow Tri-Rail service to be extended at a much lower cost to local governments and to the counties. And so this issue is raised as one that is not addressed yet to our knowledge. With that, the staff report contains a recommendation on the last page, and the recommendation suggests that Council should direct staff to do 2 things. One would be to transmit these comments to the Federal Railroad Administration in advance of the publication of the EIS. This is in advance of the formal process that we know is coming with respect to the publication of the draft EIS and those other steps that follow. So this would give the agency kind of continued advance notice. Many of these issues were already raised by Council in May of last year when the Federal Railroad Administration conducted scoping for the EIS that's underway, and is documented in a letter from council that was sent to the FRA in May of 2013. These would be evidencing those concerns again and adding the additional ones that are raised in your staff report. And secondly, due to the level of concern and questions, frankly, about the process, the staff suggests, the FRA suggests to come down and conduct workshops with local governments so everyone fully understands the process, they understand what the opportunity is for the FRA to impose modifications to the project, and the timing of the project is better understood by all. So with that, I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Delaney. Any questions that council members have for
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
You mentioned that there's been no studies done to quantify the negative impacts on property values. And the environmental impact statements, nor the financial impact statements, address the obvious determining factor of residential redevelopment and residential property values along the border. How can we report about having that fairly substantial piece of data to review and consider?
That's why it's raised as an issue, Councilman. We don't know what's in the environmental impact statement yet because it hasn't been published. But this is an issue that's been raised in a number of occasions with the public and local governments. And so the recommendation is to be sure the environmental impact statement addresses that very issue.
So the draft one we have doesn't contain any of this information?
We don't have a draft environmental impact statement.
Okay.
This is a laundry list of everything we've heard in doing all the public outreach we've done. And so the recommendation is to ask the FRA to be sure you address these things before you issue the draft EIS. Here's what we're hearing as a regional planning council in talking to local governments and others through the region. So Federal Railroad Administration, we want you to be sure you address these things. That's the recommendation to you, to council.
Mr. Davis.
Yeah, along those same lines, I think it's important that we also make sure that the draft addresses positive impacts. NEPA requires both to look at negative and positive impacts. The positive side often gets overlooked. We focus on the negative impacts of communities, the environment, and so on, but it does require the action agency to look at positive impacts, in this case positive impacts on property value. So I want to make sure this analysis is balanced.
Yes, sir.
Good to hear. Actually, I had
Mr. Overdoe?
Kim, thank you. In your summary that was attached to our agenda, there was a statement in there that said even though we're going to go through an EIS, no environmental impact permits are proposed and will be needed for this project. Can you tell us a little more about the basis of that comment?
Sure. Pardon me. As we understand it in discussions with the Federal Railroad Administration, the reason an environmental impact statement is being developed is because FECI, or all over Florida, submitted a RIF loan application. In the absence of that RIF loan application, what the FRA staff has informed us is that it would not be issuing permits. It does not believe it would be needed to issue permits for the track improvements because FECI is proposing to install a track that was historically there. The grade crossing improvements, which are again controlled by FECI or FECR, Florida East Coast Railroad. And the only permit that appears to be necessary would be the rehabilitation of the Loxahatchee River Bridge because the company is proposing to add a second track where a track previously existed. It's a different type of permit. It's not a new construction permit, but it's a rehabilitation permit. We are not aware that there would be a permit necessary for the improvements at the St. Lucie River Bridge. That said, the company would still be required to comply with environmental regulations at the state and federal level, but there isn't a typical permitting process for the improvements that are requested. This is our understanding. It is to the benefit of the region, frankly, to have this thorough environmental impact statement required, because all of the impacts for all these improvements have to be packaged, analyzed, and presented back for everybody to review. In the absence of that, it would be a very disconnected process where if a permit was necessary for perhaps a minor improvement, the Regional Planning Council wouldn't necessarily be in the loop for that discussion, nor would the local government. It would be just with the Federal Railroad Administration. So this is a much more transparent and open process that is underway. Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Solari.
Mr. Chairman, first.
Mr. Houston.
Kim, you mentioned that the EIS was approved in the Miami to West Palm.
Correct.
What issues were reviewed in that that were relevant to what we're talking about, and how did they get around those issues to issue that?
The EIS, pardon me, the EIS that was proposed from Miami to West Palm was much more narrow in scope. So it focused on the double track improvements, again, replacing a track that was historically there, which has long been identified as a priority and a need for Tri-Rail's coastal link. Thank you. Tri-Rail's coastal link service to run, pardon me, from Miami to West Palm Beach. It's actually an improvement that's been identified by the public agencies and the local governments as something they need ultimately to allow commuter rail service to run. There are also grade crossing improvements that were addressed in that document. And again, the FEC has control over those grade crossings, and so there's not the same level of review, if you will, that applies to a company that owns the grade crossing and wants to go in and modify the safety infrastructure. What was not addressed in that permit were impacts to the bridges or the stations that are to be constructed. Those were excluded from the environmental impact statement. The other things that were not addressed in that permit were the track improvements from West Palm Beach north to Cocoa, and then from Cocoa over to Orlando. Those are the subject of the current permit. So the first permit was referred to as kind of the initial segment. And so, again, those improvements have been identified long-term as desirable for the region because they accomplish other things, which particularly is the provision of commuter rail service in the form of Tri-Rail, ultimately up to Jupiter.
Actually, I promised you guys.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman.
Dr. Delaney, just a couple of quick questions. On the Tri-Rail Coastal link extension, you mentioned that, as we know, it comes to Magnolia Park now, and then you indicated that it would start from Jupiter to Noah. And I was wondering, and I was just elected a year ago, so I need to be updated on some of this. The portion between Magnolia and Jupiter, would that be included in the extension?
It would, Commissioner Wright, if I could just, oh gosh, went the wrong way. There we go. That little map on the side should be larger to make this point. But nonetheless, this map illustrates the current system concept for the Tri-Rail Coastal Link service. And that service is proposed to run from Jupiter south to Miami, initially with about 25 stations, including one in the city of Riviera Beach. And ultimately, that corridor could include more stations. There are many more communities that want stations than are currently identified in the system concept. And there are perhaps 30 or 35 stations that could ultimately be constructed on that corridor. And so this project, which is the Tri-Rail Coastal Link project, is the subject of a separate process, a project development process that actually is now just beginning. It's a 2-year evaluation of station locations and necessary infrastructure improvements to allow the commuter rail service to be extended. It will also be required to address the complete financial ramifications and responsibilities to allow that service to carry forward. How would stations be constructed and financed? How would the service be constructed from a capital standpoint? And how the service would be funded for operations and maintenance long term. And so all of those details are packaged in the documents related to the Tri-Rail Coastal Link effort that is underway.
Okay, last question. And the Riviera Beach passenger location, you indicated it's in the proposed plan now. When would the final decision be made for us to know if Riviera Beach made that cut?
Pardon me. The project development phase is supposed to begin within this next month or so. Within 2 years, the project development work must be completed for the project to be able to be submitted for federal funding, and that's how it's designed now, to be submitted for a Federal Transit Administration New Start grant, perhaps. Discussions have been underway with the city for the past 5 or 6 years with respect to the station location, land development regulations around the station, and potentially the city's financial responsibility, depending on how the project would be financed. At this point, a station in Riviera is identified in the preliminary documents, and so it continues forward, and it will be The subject of discussion of the Palm Beach MPO, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, as well as the subject for discussion with each of those local governments to determine whether or not the stadium location is right, how it can be financed, and what additional steps may be necessary to enable it to happen. Okay?
I have Commissioner Solari and I have Mayor.
I've got three things, but I'll try to be quick. First, it was very difficult putting all that together. I think you did a good job in the presentation. Following up, actually, on Mr. Weaver's question, we discussed land values. Going through this quickly, there seem to be roughly 12 to 15 economic exactions, and I've got no idea what the scale and scope of them is. It seems like the capital costs could increase by either tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, and operating costs by millions or tens of millions of dollars. Before we go forward, I would think we should have some idea of what these costs are. And I know we can't be too specific, but I don't even know what the ballpark is. So that's one. Second, in the county, there's also been a lot of discussion, and I have no idea if it has any basis in fact, but that Fortress, the company behind FEC, is supposedly also owner of a company called 10 Gaming, which is trying to promote casino gambling in Miami. And I've heard that their whole business plan is based on getting casino gambling in Miami, and I think that that is a material fact I'd like to know. The third thing is, you mentioned, I think, laundry list, and this seems to be just too much of everything. I'm wondering if we shouldn't have priorities, and at least based in Indian County, two of the priorities would seem to be just the quiet zone crossings and safe pedestrian crossings. And based on everything I've heard about the bridge crossings, I'd certainly cross that in. So if I had to pick three priorities that we ought to focus on instead of a much larger group, those would be the three. Thank you.
In response to Commissioner Solari, Jose Gonzalez is here from FECI, who can address, I would imagine, the corporate structure and the relationships that Fortress has. And with respect to prioritization, pardon me, the project is clearly of enormous regional significance. It presents opportunities and it presents challenges, and those are different in different locations. And so this list was an effort to just lay everything out, because there are different priorities among different communities. There are some benefits that come in some places that aren't attributed in others. And so that's for the subject, for the discussion of council, but that was the staff's approach in trying to develop the agenda item, which is, here's everything we've heard from all of these different parties, and it's the council's direction as to how that information should be carried forward.
And I agree with that, and I think that that's what we have to decide. I'll just go over one of those. They reallocate the freight to the CSX rail corridor. My understanding is that freight traffic is the one part of rail traffic that is profitable. So you're asking FEC to give up its profitable portion and put it over to the central corridor and have them have the burden of the passenger portion. I would just guess that on a marginal pricing basis, that would make the whole deal unprofitable to them. It would also give CSX a regional freight monopoly, and monopolies are generally bad. And the third thing it is that if we think that freight rail traffic is a burden on our communities, what we're doing is pushing that burden over to the central Florida communities. So I think in just that one issue, you've got bad economics, bad governance, and immoral action. So these are the type of problems that
Need a microphone there, Mr. Field.
Mr. Solari had some very useful observations.
Turn the microphone, please.
Commissioner Solari had some very useful observations. Two, as we, and Kim did an outstanding job in pulling all this stuff together today. Fair point, establish consistent, predictable, reasonable FECI grade crossing fee schedule for local governments is a significant point. That's something that could be extremely useful. I would like to interject this perspective that it was a single event that caused that rail crossing, and so an annual increase doesn't seem logical to me. And further interject that the value of that rail crossing is to enhance the business value of the rail line through the economic stimulation of the community. So I want you guys to lower your costs. That's the basis. The ESI, I understand, and I'm not sure, but I understand that's to also include a community impact.
The EIS.
Yes, yeah, the environmental impact statement. Yes. So we wanted to do that so that we can have those kinds of inputs that Commissioner Smart has. Thank you very much.
Thank you. By the way, I asked Mr. Bush if we would just make sure that staff are recording some of these items, because some of these clearly are some action items. I think some items that staff can act on. I had Mayor Taylor, and then Web Mayor as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kim, thank you for this information. It's very inclusive. But my question is the tracks and the freight movement. Because right now we already have problems with backup on the railroad tracking, especially in certain residential areas. Now, are we going to see this impact in the immediate, or what they're talking about doing in the immediate or long range? Because this could present a potential problem.
So with respect to freight service that's out there today, what we know in working with FDOT on the Coastal Link project is that freight service was at its highest kind of around 2007, 2008, when the economy was in a very robust posture. And so freight trains were numbering maybe 18 to 20 freight trains a day. That seems to be the estimate. That volume of freight service reduced as the economy cooled off after 2008, and so freight service was down maybe 12 to 14 trains a day, and the freight service has increased in the past several years. So now there are, I believe, 14 through trains and 4 local trains, 18 trains per day on the corridor. The post-Panamax impacts from the widening of the Panama Canal are projected to occur certainly after the canal is open, and the state has taken aggressive efforts to enable those ports to be able to receive that freight. So the deepening in Port Miami and the improvements to Port Everglades are, Port Miami is underway, Port Everglades is going through the financing process, and those impacts are expected to start to arrive in maybe 2017, 2018.
I guess what I'm asking is because we have an unusual situation in Riviera Beach. We have the switching of on the track. So to me, that could present a substantial problem for the residents of that area. And I don't know if Jose, you have addressed that, because to me that is something that we would certainly need to look into, because you already have a backup morning and afternoon and evening, and if we're going to have these other trains coming every hour up until 9 p.m., we'll never cross. Neither will we ever have emergency vehicles who can get across the track. So to me, that's a big issue.
And there are some improvements that are being made that can help remedy some of that impact. For example, as the council may recall, there was a Tiger grant awarded last year for 2 rail interconnections to be constructed. One in Northwood, which is 25th Street in West Palm Beach, and that's a connection between the CSX and FTC, and the other is called the Iris connection, and that's down in Miami at the very southern end. And that rail connection is specifically designed to enable some of that inbound freight to get out of the congested downtowns. Like between Miami and West Palm is but it would come back in West Palm and go through Riviera. Some of that freight could continue north on the CSX, but there's been no commitment, and that's the subject of the freight rationalization study the state is doing now.
Well, I would hope that anyone who looks at that would, I'm sure the Lake Park probably experience from that as well. So that is something that those communities really would be affected if we do not take a serious look at that.
And certainly added to the recommendation.
And it needs to be short, and short range, not long.
Short range. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mayor Blum.
Kim, you know that a number of the North County communities are quite concerned with the fact that there will be no reduction in freight because we're not going to benefit from the switching. And so it was interesting to learn that there is this freight rationalization study going on in a more global sense. How, and you don't have to tell me now, but is there a contact? How do the local governments and the RTC interject themselves into that study? Because it obviously that may offer the only hope that I'm seeing right now for any change in
So the freight rationalization study is an FDOT or Department of Transportation study that's underway now. It is, I think the horizon for that study is probably 18 months for it to be completed. There are initial workshops that have been held over the past few months. Staff has participated in as many of those as we can. The NPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organizations, are direct participants as well. Certainly we can forward notices of those workshops and materials to all the council members so that all local governments can be as engaged as they would want to.
Thank you. And then if you could supply a contact person within the agency, email that, I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
I have Commissioner Zerbe, Commissioner Cronin, and I have Mayor Bailey.
Mr. Chairman. Has the study included any east-west transportation services, linkages to maximize that ridership and access to city and neighborhood destinations? Because we're working on our own transportation-oriented development zones and things like that.
There's no study for us to review yet. The issue has been raised in discussions with local governments and others. FECI is really going to be the entity who can address that because we don't have a document to review yet. So we would hope that it's addressed, but we haven't seen the document yet. With respect to Charter Oak Coastal Link, there has been active discussion with respect to how additional transit connections can be established east-west. Pardon me. And it is a core focus of the project development study that's underway with respect to Charter Oak Coastal Link. All the transit providers are engaged in that effort. And so to the south, it's Palm Tran, BCT, which is Broward County Transit, and Miami-Dade Transit. They are partners in the study. They participate as part of the study's guidance, and they're actively engaged.
Thank you. Commissioner Cronin.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the Treasure Regional Plan. It seems like the information on all over Florida is very difficult to find out. It dribbles in from all different parts. And I'm happy that we have an organization that goes out of their way to make sure that everything is looked at and analyzed and is delivered to the communities. I mean, I didn't mean to give you all an advertisement, but I'm thrilled that our constituents are constantly asking us questions, and the only answers we seem to get is through this organization. I appreciate that. Recently, Fort Pierce staff had met with FEC, FRA, FDOT, AAF on the diagnostic crossings, the railroad crossings, and one of the issues that came up that was disconcerting, just to add to the fray, is a third track that's going to be added to a lot of the downtown area to divert freight trains to sit and wait until the transportation trains come through. And a lot of these crossings that are contemplated are in our downtown area. So, I mean, when we start talking about this, we cause frustration for traffic, we cause people taking their own ways to get around these things, either through running crossings or trying to go over bridges or loading up different areas of the community. So this was an interesting part, and I think we identified two of our main crossings that showed that we were going to stage a freight train there for a period of time until the speed train at 115 mile an hour come through the community. So I want to make sure that was part of the impact. I didn't even know if you mentioned that or not. I mean, you speak at 200 words a minute, and I can only hear at 120, so I'm trying to stay with
a long presentation. So, Commissioner, we have raised that issue in the past. It was raised in the EIS scoping comments that were sent to the FRA in May. If it was not overtly expressed, our apologies as staff, because it's an issue that's been consistently raised, the location of sidings, not just within downtown, but also with respect to bridges. Because if there is a synchronization to take place where a freight train slows while a passenger train is getting queued up to cross, that freight train has to slow somewhere, and that can't be a point of conflict either. Those are much longer vehicles to store. So certainly, if it was not expressly raised in the staff report, Council has consistently raised that, and it certainly can be added.
PCI, good. Mayor Bailey?
Thank you.
Commissioner Weeks?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Good morning. And thank you, Mr. Plum, for the information. Taking off one hat from representing 4 major cities, our main concern representing 13 cities and counties is St. Lucie Village, their voices being listened to in reference to the entrance. I mean, they have a lot of concerns, and I know Mayor Thies is in the audience, and I'm sure he's got a lot to say. The league is concerned that they have also a statement also, so just point it out there.
And of course, the council is representative of all local governments in the region, and we have discussed those concerns with St. Lucie Village. It's tough because each of those grade crossings needs to remain open for access, and the grade crossing issues are all raised by all local governments with respect to quiet zones and preventing vehicular conflict and noise impacts. And so certainly they would be included as one of the 54 local governments in the region that comes to be transmitted on behalf.
Did I miss any of the commissioners? Mr. Weaver?
And I think it's imperative that we have a financial impact statement to discuss both reflecting positive impacts, as Councilman Davis has mentioned, and the possible negative impacts we've talked about, and then trying to operate in the ambiguity of no definition of sealed corridor. I think that may end up being another large issue of discussion. At the minimum, it has to be a 6-foot chain link fence continuous for the entire stretch.
Well, and thank you, Councilmember, for raising that issue. With respect to trespass prevention, there is not clear guidance with respect to how that is treated along the corridor. We know we have pre-existing issues with respect to trespassing. Particularly, they've been noted in communities like Jupiter, West Palm Beach, and Lake Worth, where you can see the cow paths walking to the point where the tracks cross. The FRA, we've had a chance to meet with FRA staff on this very issue during the diagnostic field reviews. The FRA has funding available both to evaluate the extent of illegal trespassing and mitigate illegal trespassing. It has been viewed by some as a double-edged sword because we're not used to seeing a fence along that corridor today, and it would require some type of fencing or barrier, which could be landscape materials. Bougainvillea was suggested as a landscape material that could be planted along the edge to prevent illegal trespassing. That might be visually more appealing than fencing. And so we're in discussion with the FRA on that opportunity. It's been raised as an issue outside of the Oliver Florida project. It's been raised as an issue ongoing. And so we're in dialogue with them to explore how we can avail ourselves of those resources to understand the problem and mitigate it. Okay.
Commissioner Crosstown. Kim, thank you. This week, Investors Business Daily reported that the National Transportation Trust Fund would be completely exhausted by August of this year. Is all of this funding associated with the issues we've been talking about privately funded, or would any of it be subject to federal funding?
Commissioner, that's a question that I need to do some research on to understand the answer. The FRA staff has been clear that the details related to the RIF loan remain confidential, and so we have limited information with respect to the RIF loan other than it is implemented through the Federal Railroad Administration. But we're not aware of what the source of funding is for those dollars to be loaned. There are other aspects of the project, like hybrid grants that were mentioned earlier, that I don't know what the relationship is between the Transportation Trust Fund and hybrid grants. So we certainly have more work to do with respect to that question, and so we'll do that and report back to council.
And I know the other committees are concerned about that as well, because I believe you all applied for $7.4 million in the private grant you applied for to Palm Beach County. But then I think you have about $6.9 million match or so that you set aside. So Robert would really be on date as well. Okay, did I miss any council members?